Are you really going to let him walk in here like that? Jason Carter's voice echoed through the cafeteria, sharp and mocking, drawing the attention of everyone seated nearby, and all eyes instinctively turned toward the gray-haired man at the far end of the room, Michael Harris, who sat quietly with his back straight and hands folded on the table, his deep brown eyes scanning the room with a calm precision that belied his age. His black skin standing out against the faded beige of the prison walls and the dull metal of the cafeteria benches, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that did nothing to diminish the air of quiet authority Michael exuded. Despite the whispers and snickers from the younger inmates, Jason's group, 3 men all in their 30s, leaned casually against the wall, their white complexions accentuating their aggressive posture. Laughing among themselves as if their mockery were a performance, the cafeteria filled with the low hum of chatter, clanging trays, and the occasional call from a guard. Yet the focus remained on the subtle tension building between these men, the unspoken challenge that seemed to hang in the air like a taut rope ready to snap. Michael remained perfectly still, his eyes following Jason's movements with the patience of a seasoned observer, remembering every nuance of the room, every reaction of the people around him, the years of discipline and training that had taught him to control his body and mind, to move only when the moment was precise and necessary, to allow others to reveal themselves fully before he responded. And now, in this simple act of sitting quietly, he was already asserting a presence that was impossible to ignore. Jason took a slow step forward, his grin widening, assuming superiority over someone who seemed defenseless, unaware of the countless hours Michael had spent mastering the body's mechanics, practicing precision strikes and evasive maneuvers, learning the art of control over brute strength, each movement calculated and deliberate, the kind of mastery that could end confrontations without causing permanent harm, a mastery hidden beneath the surface of quiet aging. The whispers among other inmates grew louder, some commenting on the audacity of Jason and his companions, others intrigued by the measured calm of the gray-haired man, the tension building like a drumbeat, rhythmic and insistent, signaling that something significant was about to unfold. Michael's hands shifted slightly on the table, almost imperceptibly, the subtle motion catching the eye of a few attentive prisoners, a hint that there was more beneath the surface, a confidence that did not require words or loud gestures to be felt. And as Jason moved even closer, pushing a chair back roughly to emphasize his dominance, the cafeteria seemed to hold its breath, the clatter of trays and utensils fading into the background, the focus narrowing to the 2 men and the invisible thread of challenge connecting them. Michael's gaze never wavered, steady and unwavering, and in that moment, the contrast between perceived frailty and hidden strength became starkly apparent, a tension that demanded recognition, a silent declaration that age and quietude could mask an extraordinary capability, the kind of capability that once revealed would shift the dynamics of the entire block, command attention, and earn respect without a single harsh word. The energy in the room shifted subtly, the younger inmates sensing the undercurrent of authority in Michael's posture, the calculated calm of a man who had lived through far more than appearances suggested, and even Jason, confident and loud, could not fully ignore the quiet weight of presence emanating from Michael Harris, a presence that promised consequences measured and just. And as the lunch line moved slowly, the cafeteria, filled with the smells of simple prison fare and the low murmur of conversation, Michael remained poised, an island of control amid the restless energy, his mind cataloging each detail, each sound, each shift in the room, preparing for the moment when his experience, skill, and calm decisiveness would make themselves unmistakably known. A quiet storm waiting for the right instant, a revelation about to unfold that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. The gray-haired man, Michael Harris, sitting alone yet commanding the room, demonstrating that true strength often comes silently, measured in patience and observation, ready to assert itself when the timing is perfect, earning the notice of all who witnessed his composed demeanor and hinting at the legendary fighter within. Michael Harris's calm demeanor did not waver as he observed the younger inmates whispering and pointing, their laughter echoing across the drab cafeteria, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows that highlighted every subtle shift in posture and expression. And though Jason Carter and his companions tried to maintain an air of dominance, their confident grins faltered slightly under Michael's steady gaze, his black skin reflecting a quiet authority that seemed to grow with each passing second. The cafeteria, filled with the usual clatter of trays and low conversations, now held an undercurrent of tension, a silent recognition among the prisoners that something significant was unfolding, and Michael remained seated with his back straight, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, each finger slightly flexed as if ready to respond to any sudden movement, his mind cataloging every detail, from the placement of the chairs to the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hall, every sensory input adding to the mental map he was constructing, a map that would allow him to navigate the space with precision. Jason, unaware of the depth of Michael's experience, leaned in slightly, trying to provoke a reaction, his voice rising just enough to draw more attention from the surrounding prisoners. But Michael's expression remained unchanged, serene yet alert, projecting a calm confidence that contrasted sharply with Jason's aggressive posturing, the gray hair framing his face a testament to years of experience and discipline, a signal that appearances could be deceiving. A few of the younger inmates shifted uncomfortably, sensing the subtle power emanating from Michael, a presence that did not need to assert itself physically to be acknowledged, and whispers spread quietly, speculating about the quiet man's background, some recalling stories of inmates who had served in the military or excelled in martial arts, others simply noting the uncanny precision in the way he observed and reacted to his surroundings. The cafeteria's usual chatter now punctuated with cautious glances toward Michael. The tension built. Slowly, a crescendo felt in the slight stiffening of shoulders and the lowered volume of conversation, Jason attempting once more to assert dominance by moving a tray noisily. But Michael's eyes followed him calmly, unflinching, a subtle shift of his head signaling awareness and readiness without overt movement, demonstrating the control cultivated through years of disciplined practice, the type that allowed a person to maintain composure under scrutiny and command respect silently. As the lunch period progressed, the dynamics of the room continued to shift subtly, the younger inmates adjusting their positions, some sitting slightly farther back, others observing Michael's subtle reactions, all recognizing the contrast between their own restless energy and the measured patience of the gray-haired man, whose presence alone began to alter the social landscape of the block, his experience and composure creating an invisible influence that extended beyond physical space, instilling a sense of respect and caution. Michael's eyes scanned the room, noting every potential movement, every nervous twitch and quiet exchange, building an internal map that would guide any future interactions. And in that observation, there was a quiet power, a latent strength that required no demonstration of force, the kind of mastery that spoke volumes through restraint, focus, and the subtle projection of confidence. As the final trays were collected and the noise of the cafeteria began to ebb slightly, Michael remained seated, a quiet sentinel whose presence alone had shifted the energy of the room. The younger inmates' laughter, now tempered with awareness, and Jason, recognizing for the first time the depth of experience across from him, paused, uncertainty flickering across his expression, realizing that the gray-haired prisoner's quiet control and measured observation were indicators of capabilities far beyond initial appearances. A revelation that would shape interactions throughout the rest of the day, and perhaps the block itself. The afternoon count ended, and the heavy metal doors opened one section at a time, allowing the inmates to move toward the recreation yard. But the atmosphere inside Blackwood had changed since lunch, because the story of the gray-haired prisoner who refused to react had already spread across the block, and every conversation seemed to circle back to the same question. Who was Michael Harris, and why did he look so calm, while everyone else lived on edge? The older man stepped outside carrying a worn paperback novel he had borrowed from the small prison library, walking with an easy pace that neither rushed nor hesitated, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes quietly studying the yard, as though he had already seen places far more difficult than this one. Jason Carter watched him from a picnic table where he sat with three of his closest friends, and although he laughed with them, his attention never really left the old prisoner, because there was something about Michael that did not make sense. Most new inmates either tried to prove themselves or tried to disappear, but Michael did neither. He simply existed with a quiet confidence that seemed completely natural. One of Jason's friends leaned closer and whispered, "I still think he is scared." Jason looked toward Michael and slowly shook his head. Scared people do not look around like that. They look at the ground. The younger inmate frowned, unable to understand what Jason meant. But Jason himself was not entirely sure either. He only knew that something about the old man felt different. Across the yard, Michael found an empty bench beneath a faded shade structure and sat down, opening his book without saying a word. A few inmates passed by and glanced at him, expecting some kind of reaction after what had happened in the cafeteria, but he simply turned a page and continued reading. A correctional officer walking the fence line slowed for a moment, looked at Michael, and then continued on, almost as though the old prisoner had somehow made the noisy yard feel quieter. Several minutes later, a basketball bounced loose from a game on the far side of the court, rolling across the cracked pavement directly toward the drainage grate near the fence. One of the younger inmates shouted after it, but everyone could see it would disappear before anyone reached it. Michael looked up from his book, stood calmly, and took 2 slow steps forward, placing the sole of his shoe gently on top of the ball just before it reached the opening. The movement was smooth and effortless, almost casual. He bent down, picked up the ball, and handed it back to the young inmate with a small smile. "You almost lost that." The young man nodded and thanked him before jogging away. The entire moment lasted only a few seconds, but Jason had watched every part of it. The timing had been perfect, not lucky, not rushed, simply perfect. One of his friends laughed and said, "Nice catch for an old guy." But Jason did not laugh, because he had noticed something nobody else seemed to see. Michael had never actually looked down at the ball while he stopped it. His eyes had stayed on the young inmate running after it, as though he already knew exactly where the ball would be. Jason crossed his arms and kept watching. The old prisoner returned to his bench and opened his book again as if nothing unusual had happened. Nearby, another inmate named Frank Holloway had seen the same thing. Frank had spent years inside Blackwood and had watched hundreds of men play games, fight over pride, and pretend to be tougher than they really were. But he had never seen anyone move with that kind of control. It reminded him of something from long ago, a memory that refused to become clear. He looked at Michael, then looked away, trying to remember where he had seen that kind of balance before. As the afternoon slowly faded and long shadows stretched across the yard, Michael quietly closed his book and looked toward the setting sun beyond the prison fence. There was no sadness in his face and no anger, only patience. The kind of patience built over a lifetime. And while the other inmates walked back toward their housing units talking about what they had just witnessed, Jason Carter remained standing beside the basketball court, staring at the gray-haired prisoner and realizing that the old man everyone had laughed at might be hiding a story far greater than anyone inside Blackwood had imagined. As the sun climbed higher, the gray-haired prisoner remained on the bench, reading his worn paperback while the yard bustled around him with typical mid-morning energy. Inmates moving in small groups, playing makeshift games, or just walking with purpose. But Michael Harris, with his calm demeanor and measured steps, seemed entirely separate from the chaos. A quiet observer rather than a participant, Jason Carter, still intrigued by the older man's presence, watched from the edge of the basketball court, noticing how Michael's eyes scanned the environment, not with anxiety, but with an awareness that suggested a deep understanding of people and space. He observed how other inmates approached, some trying to draw attention, others moving cautiously, and yet Michael neither engaged nor recoiled. He simply acknowledged their presence with subtle nods, his posture relaxed but precise, like a man accustomed to reading situations instantly. As a group of younger inmates began tossing a worn football back and forth, one of them lost control, and the ball rolled directly toward Michael's feet. Without hesitation, he stepped lightly, caught it with ease, and returned it with a small, encouraging smile, a gesture that drew quiet glances from those nearby, a subtle assertion that he was both present and aware. A few inmates whispered to each other, speculating on his age and strength. The yard's usual noise momentarily softened, as if the presence of a calm, confident figure could influence the energy of the space. Michael returned to his book, opening to a page that had previously held his attention, his hands steady, eyes focused. And the sense of authority he exuded without any words began to settle around the yard. Jason felt an unusual mixture of respect and curiosity. He could sense there was more to this man than met the eye. The older prisoner, despite his quiet appearance, seemed to embody a discipline and confidence that suggested a lifetime of experience. Every subtle movement, every choice of posture and gaze contributed to an invisible aura of competence, a quiet power that even the most brash inmates unconsciously acknowledged. As lunchtime approached and the guard whistle signaled transitions between areas, Michael closed his book slowly, stood with deliberate ease, and walked toward the dining area at a pace that neither hurried nor drew attention. The inmates nearby noticed, but could not decipher why the older man commanded such presence without imposing it. Jason followed at a distance, observing how Michael navigated the yard, avoiding unnecessary interactions, yet effortlessly maintaining situational awareness. Conversations around the yard shifted from casual chatter to reflections on the older man's behavior. Questions arose about his past, and while no one knew the answers, the consistency of his calm, assured presence set a tone that few could challenge. By the time Michael reached the doorway to the dining hall, the energy of the yard seemed to have shifted subtly, a respect unspoken but tangible, and Jason, still watching, realized that the gray-haired prisoner was quietly becoming a figure around whom the yard's dynamics were reorganizing. Not through words or confrontations, but through a composed confidence that hinted at abilities and experiences far beyond the usual prison routines. As he entered the hall, other inmates instinctively gave him space, some out of curiosity, others perhaps sensing a skill or discipline hidden beneath the calm exterior. Michael found a seat in a corner, opened his book once more, and the subtle effect of his presence lingered, with Jason observing and pondering the story that this man's quiet strength was beginning to write among the prisoners around him. The afternoon meal ended, and the steady rhythm of Blackwood State Prison returned once again. Metal doors closing, correctional officers calling out instructions, and inmates slowly making their way toward work assignments and recreation areas. But Michael Harris followed a different path, carrying the same worn paperback beneath one arm as he walked toward the small prison library tucked inside the oldest part of the building, a place few inmates visited unless they wanted a quiet moment. Away from the noise, the room smelled of old paper and polished wood, and behind the front desk sat Eleanor Brooks, the elderly volunteer librarian who had spent almost 20 years helping inmates discover books that could take their minds somewhere beyond concrete walls. She looked up as Michael entered and smiled warmly. "You finished it already." Michael handed her the novel carefully, making sure the cover remained straight. "It was a good story." Eleanor nodded and placed the book on the return cart. "Most people around here only come for magazines." Michael glanced across the shelves. "Sometimes people just need a place where nobody expects anything from them." Eleanor studied him for a moment before quietly saying, "You do not seem like someone who has spent his whole life inside places like this." Michael simply smiled and changed the subject by asking if she had anything about American history. She walked toward the back shelves and returned with an old hardcover book, the edges worn from years of use. While she searched, another inmate entered the library, Frank Holloway, a quiet man in his late 40s who preferred books over conversations. Frank noticed Michael immediately because he had already heard about the strange old prisoner who never reacted to insults. He picked up a stack of old sports magazines from a donation box and carried them to a nearby table, flipping through them absent-mindedly, while Eleanor and Michael talked softly near the shelves. Outside the library window, Jason Carter happened to walk past with two friends. He slowed his pace when he saw the gray-haired prisoner inside. One of his companions laughed. "Look at him, hiding in a library now." Jason did not answer right away. He kept watching as Michael reached for a book on the highest shelf. One volume near the top slipped loose and started falling. Eleanor gasped quietly because it was moving directly toward her, but before the book could hit the floor, Michael turned and caught it smoothly against his forearm without even looking directly at it. Then he handed it back to her as naturally as though he had simply picked it up from a table. Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Thank you." Michael nodded politely. Books deserve better than hard landings. Jason frowned through the window because the movement had happened too quickly. One of his friends shrugged. "Lucky catch." But Jason was not convinced. Across the room, Frank Holloway had also seen it. And for some reason, the way Michael had moved made an old memory stir somewhere in the back of his mind. He looked down at the sports magazine lying open in front of him and noticed a faded photograph from a martial arts tournament many years earlier. The image was damaged, and most of the faces had become impossible to recognize. But one figure standing in the center held a posture that seemed strangely familiar, shoulders relaxed, hands loosely folded, perfectly balanced. Frank looked up at Michael again and then back at the picture, trying to understand why the old photograph suddenly felt important. Meanwhile, Michael accepted the history book from Eleanor and thanked her before sitting quietly at a table near the window. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the library floor, and the room became silent except for the turning of pages. Jason eventually walked away from the window, but the image of the old prisoner catching the falling book stayed with him, and Frank Holloway quietly folded the old magazine page and slipped it into his pocket. Because deep inside he felt that he had just stumbled across the first piece of a story far bigger than anyone inside Blackwood State Prison could possibly imagine. As the evening bell echoed through the halls of Blackwood State Prison, Michael Harris made his way back to the common room, his steps deliberate yet unhurried. The gray-haired prisoner carrying himself with a quiet confidence that had grown over the past weeks. He moved past clusters of inmates engaged in low murmurs and card games, nodding politely to a few familiar faces without breaking his calm demeanor. Meanwhile, Jason Carter and his gang lingered near the corner of the room, their eyes tracking Michael with a mix of curiosity and barely contained irritation. They whispered among themselves, guessing at his past and wondering why no one dared challenge him. Unaware that Michael had once trained countless individuals in self-discipline and strategy, skills now buried under the exterior of a reserved man, Frank Holloway, seated at a table near the far wall, observed quietly, his hands resting over a small notebook, jotting down notes about routines, behaviors, and patterns of those around him. While Michael reached for a deck of playing cards on a nearby shelf, his movements precise and measured. As he shuffled the cards with ease, several inmates paused to watch, some out of idle curiosity, others sensing an unspoken authority emanating from him. Eleanor Brooks, standing behind the service counter, kept a discreet eye on the room, noting the subtle tension and the way interactions seemed to shift around Michael. She adjusted a few books and straightened the shelves, offering a brief nod to Michael as he passed. Acknowledging his presence without drawing attention, Jason stepped forward, a smirk forming, leaning slightly toward one of his friends. "Think he's hiding anything?" he whispered, his tone a mix of mockery and challenge. Michael paused mid-step, glanced in Jason's direction without anger or confrontation, then continued toward an empty table near the window, setting the deck down and beginning a solitary game, his focus unwavering. The room seemed to adjust to his calm energy, conversations lowering, movements slowing. And even the usually brash Jason hesitated, sensing a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Over the next few minutes, Michael's quiet routine continued, arranging the cards, glancing occasionally at a clock above the far doorway, observing the ebb and flow of activity with a careful, practiced eye. Frank made subtle notes, capturing how Michael's presence influenced the dynamics around him, noticing small gestures, a tilt of the head, a pause in speech, or a moment of hesitation. Michael then reached for a cup of water, lifting it deliberately and taking a slow sip, maintaining composure as if the simple act was part of a larger strategy to project calm and control. A few younger inmates tried to engage him in light conversation, asking about his time in the library or books he had recently read. Michael responded with measured, polite words, sharing small insights, but never revealing more than necessary. Each response delivered in a way that commanded respect without demanding it. Jason shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the usual tactics of intimidation would not work here. His friends exchanged glances, noting the quiet authority and awareness in Michael's demeanor. The common room continued its rhythm with cards, quiet chatter, and occasional laughter, yet around Michael, a subtle gravity kept interactions in check. Eleanor quietly refilled a water pitcher while observing the calm control exerted without overt action. Frank watched keenly, noting that influence and authority could be asserted through presence, routine, and measured interactions alone. As the evening deepened, Michael completed his solitary game, gathered the cards neatly, and returned them to the shelf with deliberate care, his movements fluid and confident, and then he settled into a chair by the window, gazing outside at the courtyard, blending seamlessly into the environment, yet remaining unmistakably in command of the subtle currents in the room. The air seemed to hold a quiet tension, an unspoken understanding that Michael Harris was not to be underestimated, even by the loudest and most confident inmates in the block. And as lights dimmed for the night, the subtle authority of the gray-haired prisoner lingered, shaping interactions without a single raised voice or overt confrontation, leaving an impression that would quietly resonate through the following days, ensuring that every movement and decision in the room accounted for his presence, and that the old, quiet man commanded more attention than anyone could have predicted. The next morning arrived with the familiar sound of metal doors unlocking and correctional officers calling out instructions across Blackwood State Prison. And while most of the inmates shuffled through their routines with tired expressions, Michael Harris stepped out of his cell already composed, his gray hair neatly combed, his uniform clean, and his movements carrying the same quiet precision that had begun to attract attention throughout the block. He walked toward the dining hall with an old paperback tucked beneath his arm, greeting a few older inmates with a simple nod, never seeking attention, yet somehow becoming impossible to ignore. Jason Carter watched from the opposite side of the corridor, pretending to joke with his friends, but his eyes followed Michael every step of the way. Because the image from the library the previous afternoon refused to leave his mind, the effortless way the old prisoner had caught the falling book did not seem accidental, and the basketball incident before that had looked just as unusual. One of Jason's friends laughed quietly and said, "Maybe the old man was some kind of athlete." Jason shrugged. But deep inside he was no longer certain that the answer was that simple. Meanwhile, Frank Holloway sat alone at a cafeteria table with the folded magazine page hidden inside one of his books. He had looked at the faded photographs several times during the night, and every time he compared the figure in the picture to Michael Harris, the same strange feeling returned. The posture was almost identical, relaxed shoulders, balanced stance, and a calm expression that suggested absolute confidence. But the photograph was too damaged to reveal a face clearly. After breakfast, Michael made his way toward the prison library once again. Eleanor Brooks was already organizing a new shipment of donated books, and she smiled warmly when she saw him. "I thought you might come back today." Michael returned the smile and quietly helped her move a heavy box onto the sorting table. Despite his age, the movement looked smooth and effortless. Eleanor laughed softly and said, "You make that look lighter." "Then it is," Michael simply answered. "When you learn the right way to move, heavy things stop feeling so heavy." Frank happened to be sitting only a few feet away, pretending to read while secretly listening to every word. That simple sentence stirred another old memory. Many years ago, he had watched a documentary about traditional martial arts, and one of the instructors had said almost the exact same thing. Frank reached into his pocket and unfolded the old magazine page once again, studying the damaged photograph while occasionally looking toward Michael, trying to force the memory into focus. Outside the library windows, the recreation yard had started to fill with inmates. Jason wandered past slowly, stopping just long enough to glance inside. He saw Michael helping Eleanor stack books onto a shelf. One volume slipped from the top and started sliding toward the floor. But before anyone else could react, Michael extended one hand and gently guided the book back into place without even changing his expression. Jason narrowed his eyes because the movement was so small that most people would have missed it entirely. But to him it felt almost practiced, almost professional. He walked away without saying a word. Later that afternoon, the recreation yard buzzed with conversation, and more inmates than usual seemed to be watching the gray-haired prisoner. Some whispered that he had once been a coach. Others guessed he had served in the military, but nobody truly knew. Michael sat quietly beneath the same shade structure as before, reading his book while the world moved around him. A younger inmate accidentally dropped a handful of playing cards, and a sudden gust of wind scattered them across the pavement. Without thinking, Michael reached out and caught one drifting card between two fingers before it could disappear beneath a bench. He handed it back with a gentle smile. The younger inmate thanked him and hurried away, but Jason had seen it happen from across the yard, and this time he did not laugh. Because ordinary people did not move like that. Frank looked up from his own bench at exactly the same moment, his eyes moving from the floating card to the faded magazine page in his hands, and suddenly one small detail became clear. Beneath the damaged photograph, he could just barely make out a headline that read, "Legendary National Fighting Champion Visits Community Youth Program." Frank's heart began to race as he slowly lifted his eyes toward Michael Harris, realizing that the quiet old prisoner sitting alone beneath the afternoon sun might not simply be an ordinary man who had aged well, but someone whose name had once been known far beyond the walls of Blackwood State Prison. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prison yard as Michael Harris moved with calm purpose, his gray hair glinting subtly under the light, each step measured and deliberate, drawing quiet attention from the inmates around him. Jason Carter lingered near the edge of the yard, pretending to watch the clouds while his eyes never left Michael. He whispered to a friend, "Watch him. Something about that man is off." His friend shrugged, not noticing the subtle precision in the way Michael adjusted a fallen broom against the wall, then resumed his path toward the exercise area. Michael paused to help an older inmate who had dropped a pair of reading glasses, handing them back without breaking his stride. The gesture simple, yet commanding respect. Frank Holloway observed from a bench, the old magazine page still clutched in his hands, his eyes darting between Michael and the photo, connecting details that had previously eluded him. The morning routines continued, but the tension in the yard was palpable. Whispers spread among the younger inmates speculating about Michael's past. Could he have been in the military? One asked, another suggested. Maybe a professional athlete, but none knew the truth. Michael approached the basketball court, his presence alone causing casual players to pause. He picked up a stray ball, spinning it deftly between his hands before passing it back with a nod to a surprised inmate. Jason's curiosity grew, realizing that each small action seemed intentional, calculated, hinting at skill that far surpassed normal ability. Later, as lunch was served in the mess hall, Michael quietly helped set trays for those who had trouble reaching, his movements fluid, efficient, and unnoticed by most, except for Jason, who was increasingly uneasy. Frank observed quietly from the corner, recognizing patterns in Michael's posture and the way he handled objects. Memories of martial arts techniques he had read about decades ago resurfaced. The connection felt undeniable. During recreation, a group of inmates started a casual game of handball. Michael joined with ease, not dominating the play, but moving with an effortless control that subtly shifted the dynamics of the game. Jason and his friends stood aside, exchanging glances that mixed suspicion and intrigue. They had underestimated him. Michael's calm demeanor and precise actions left an unspoken message. Authority without arrogance, skill without showmanship. Frank made mental notes, realizing that this quiet, gray-haired man might indeed be the legendary fighter hinted at in the faded magazine photograph. The yard, once noisy and chaotic, seemed to bend subtly around Michael's presence, respect growing organically as smaller incidents unfolded. A dropped water bottle was intercepted, a misthrown ball corrected midair. Each action small, yet significant. By the time the afternoon bell rang for lockdown, the collective mood in the yard had shifted. Inmates whispered among themselves, new boundaries forming silently. Michael walked back to his cell with the same composed steps, his eyes calm and observant. Jason lingered, unable to shake the sense of unexpected power and discipline emanating from the old prisoner. Frank followed discreetly, cataloging every movement and gesture, the picture in his hand now fully resonating with what he had witnessed. It was clear that Michael Harris was no ordinary inmate, and the legend hinted at in the old photograph was very much alive within him. The block had felt a subtle transformation, one that would influence interactions for days to come, and as doors clanged shut, signaling the end of recreation. The quiet respect Michael inspired lingered, unspoken yet pervasive. Everyone who had observed him carried a new awareness of the depth behind the gray-haired man's composed exterior, a presence that demanded recognition without a word being spoken. The early morning sunlight streamed through the narrow windows of the prison corridor, illuminating the gray concrete and casting long, sharp shadows across the floor as Michael Harris walked with measured steps, his posture calm and unwavering, every inmate in the hallway instinctively giving him space. Jason Carter, leaning against the far wall, crossed his arms and whispered to a nearby inmate, "Watch him. There is something different about that old man." His eyes narrowing as he tried to read Michael's intentions. yet found only composed focus and quiet strength. Michael paused briefly by a bulletin board, reading the posted schedules with precise attention, then continued toward the exercise yard, where the usual morning chatter and laughter filled the air. The younger inmates momentarily distracted by a stray ball rolling toward them. Michael bent slightly, picked it up, and returned it to its proper place with effortless grace, his actions subtle yet commanding respect. Jason's curiosity and unease grew as he observed every calculated move. The gray-haired prisoner seemed to exert influence without a single word during the yard exercises. Michael demonstrated fluid movements as he stretched and adjusted his stance, showing controlled flexibility and balance that caught the attention of several onlookers. Jason whispered again, "What has he done? I feel like we are missing something." Frank Holloway, quietly sitting on a bench, traced the lines of Michael's body with his eyes, recalling techniques he had read about in martial arts manuals decades ago, the movements unmistakably precise. Calculated, disciplined, Michael noticed a younger inmate struggling to catch a ball and subtly altered his own steps to redirect it, preventing an accidental collision. The yard shifted imperceptibly around his presence, attention and respect spreading naturally among the inmates. Whispers traveled about Michael's past, speculations ranging from military service to professional sports, yet none knew the exact truth. He helped organize small equipment, picking up a fallen cone and setting it upright, gestures that spoke of competence and order. During a casual game, Michael joined effortlessly, not dominating play, but subtly guiding the flow with small interventions that were both unnoticed and profoundly effective. Jason's group paused mid-game, sensing an unexpected control emanating from the gray-haired man. The dynamics of the yard changed without confrontation. Michael's calm presence and precise, confident actions silently shifted perceptions. By lunchtime, the inmates had begun noticing a pattern in his behavior, small acts of efficiency, quiet assistance, and measured movements hinting at deeper skill and discipline. Frank quietly cataloged each motion, confirming his suspicion that Michael Harris was no ordinary inmate. The legendary fighter hinted at in old accounts seemed fully embodied in him. As the bell rang signaling the end of morning activities, the inmates returned to their cells carrying a newfound awareness and respect. Whispers of his abilities lingering in the corridors, an unspoken acknowledgement forming that the gray-haired prisoner commanded recognition not through force, but through the sheer clarity of his presence and the subtle authority in his actions. The yard, once noisy and chaotic, retained an air of measured order, the story of Michael Harris quietly influencing the environment, leaving both Jason and others pondering the true extent of the legendary skills hidden beneath the calm exterior. The morning ended with the gray-haired prisoner walking back to his cell with quiet dignity. The atmosphere forever altered, respect and curiosity mingling in every glance cast toward him, a sense of anticipation building for what the day would reveal next, as the inmates and guards alike adjusted to the subtle but undeniable command Michael exuded. The block carried the knowledge that beneath the unassuming exterior lay a man whose past and skill were deeply felt even without a word spoken. The quiet mystery surrounding Michael Harris continued to spread through Blackwood State Prison like a story passed from table to table, because every day someone noticed another small detail that did not fit the image of an ordinary gray-haired inmate. And on that particular afternoon, the recreation yard seemed unusually focused on him. Michael sat beneath the same shade structure with a history book resting on his lap, turning the pages slowly while the sounds of bouncing basketballs and casual conversations filled the air. Jason Carter stood near the handball court pretending not to pay attention, but his eyes drifted toward the older man every few seconds. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Curiosity. One of his friends laughed quietly and said, "Maybe the old guy was some kind of school teacher." Jason did not answer because he remembered every strange thing he had witnessed over the last several days. The perfect timing with the basketball, the effortless catch in the library, the smooth way Michael seemed to move without wasted energy. Across the yard, Frank Holloway carried the old magazine page folded inside his pocket, and during the previous night he had spent hours trying to remember where he had seen that faded photograph. Before he finally realized it had come from a community sports magazine nearly 20 years old. one that featured famous athletes and instructors who volunteered to help young people stay away from gangs and crime. The headline had been damaged, but one phrase remained visible: legendary fighting champion. Frank sat down on a bench and quietly watched Michael again, comparing the man in front of him to the shadowy figure from the photograph. Meanwhile, Eleanor Brooks arrived with a card of donated books for the small reading program that some inmates attended each week. She smiled warmly when she saw Michael and waved him over. "Could you help me sort these again?" Michael closed his book and walked toward her without hesitation. Several boxes had shifted during transport, and one stack of books leaned dangerously near the edge of the cart. Before Eleanor could react, one heavy volume slipped free and started falling toward the pavement. Michael reached out and gently caught it with one hand before it hit the ground, then calmly placed it back on the cart as though nothing unusual had happened. Jason had been watching from across the yard, and this time he knew it was not luck. His expression changed. One of his friends noticed and laughed. "You look like you saw a ghost," Jason quietly replied. "No, I think I saw someone who has been pretending not to be noticed." Frank heard those words from a short distance away and slowly reached into his pocket. Unfolding the old magazine page one more time, he looked at the faded picture, then looked at Michael helping Eleanor organize books with quiet patience. And suddenly, another memory surfaced. Years ago, he had watched a television interview with a famous martial arts instructor who had said that the strongest people never needed to prove they were strong. Frank could not remember the man's name, but he remembered the calm smile and the way he stood, perfectly balanced, exactly like Michael Harris. The realization sent a chill through him, because if his memory was correct, then the quiet old prisoner everyone had laughed at was once known across the country. The afternoon continued peacefully. Michael finished helping Eleanor and returned to his bench. Opening his history book once again, several younger inmates walked by and greeted him respectfully, no longer laughing, no longer whispering, simply nodding as they passed. Jason watched the entire scene unfold, and for the first time since Michael arrived at Blackwood, he took a few steps toward him, stopping only a few feet away. The older man looked up from his book and met his eyes with complete calm. Jason hesitated. All the jokes he had prepared suddenly felt meaningless. He looked at the history book, then back at Michael and quietly asked, "Who were you before you came here?" Michael closed the book gently and smiled, not with pride or anger, but with the patience of someone who had answered that question many times before. Then he simply said, "A man does not stop being himself just because the world forgets his name." Jason stood there in silence, unable to explain why those words stayed with him long after he walked away. And from his bench across the yard, Frank Holloway looked down at the old magazine page one final time, because deep inside he was almost certain that he had finally remembered exactly who Michael Harris really was. The morning light filtered through the narrow windows of Blackwood State Prison, casting long shadows across the familiar gray walls as Michael Harris stepped out of his cell with the calm composure of someone who had seen more of life than anyone around him. Across the hall, Jason Carter leaned against the railing, pretending not to observe. But his curiosity had grown since yesterday, when Michael had quietly corrected an inmate in the library without raising his voice, an effortless display of authority that seemed to ripple through the room. Today the common area was unusually quiet. A few inmates whispered to one another as they noticed Michael moving with precise, measured steps toward the recreation yard. The courtyard smelled faintly of damp concrete and recently mown grass, and Eleanor Brooks was already there, arranging chairs and tables for the morning reading session. She greeted Michael with a warm smile and a nod. "Morning. Could you help me with the tables today?" Michael returned the nod without hesitation, carefully lifting and adjusting the furniture with a strength that seemed natural and unexerted. Jason watched intently, noting every motion and comparing it to his mental picture of an ordinary prisoner. As the session began, Michael calmly instructed several inmates on how to stack the books neatly, his tone firm yet kind, commanding attention without forcing it. Meanwhile, whispers circulated about the old man with gray hair who moved with the precision and calm of someone trained extensively. The rumor spread that he had once been a legendary figure in martial arts, though few dared speak it aloud. Michael's eyes scanned the yard, catching small signs of tension and curiosity, and he responded not with dominance, but with measured gestures and subtle expressions that eased apprehension. Jason approached cautiously, carrying a tray of supplies, and hesitated a few feet from Michael, who looked up and met his gaze directly. An unspoken acknowledgement passed between them as the world seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Other inmates shifted their attention, realizing that Michael's presence was not just that of a quiet elder, but of someone who commanded respect through actions rather than words. Frank Holloway lingered in the background, holding the old magazine page he had found, his fingers tracing the faded text as he tried to confirm his suspicions. Every small interaction, every careful movement by Michael, seemed to reinforce the idea that this gray-haired prisoner was far from ordinary. As Michael helped Eleanor finish arranging the materials, he paused and gestured for a young inmate struggling with a stack of books, offering guidance without condescension. Jason noticed the way others deferred to Michael naturally. The confidence and poise that had been evident in the library and courtyard before now extending to every corner of the common area. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow as Michael adjusted a chair with effortless precision, the whispered conversations around him fading into background noise. Eleanor watched quietly, sensing the subtle influence Michael had over the group, and even Jason felt a shift inside. Realizing the man he had underestimated was operating on a level of awareness and skill far beyond anything he had anticipated, Michael finally settled into a chair with a gentle sigh, opening a notebook to review some notes, while the other inmates began to settle around him for the reading session. And though the morning had started like any other, the energy in the room had changed, a quiet recognition spreading. And Frank held the magazine page a moment longer, confirming his thoughts. Michael Harris was indeed the legendary figure he had suspected, though now he chose to remain silent about it, letting his actions speak. And as the first story was read aloud, Michael listened, the calm presence radiating through the room, altering the dynamics of the yard, of the common area, and of the inmates, who now knew that their gray-haired peer was a man whose past commanded respect and whose present demanded careful attention, all without a single boast or unnecessary display, leaving Jason, Eleanor, and Frank with a new understanding that the quietest prisoner often held the greatest power of all. The afternoon sun cast a muted glow over the prison yard, highlighting the worn concrete and scattered patches of grass as Michael Harris moved with deliberate calm toward the outdoor reading area. The previous morning's quiet had set a precedent that now seemed to settle over the entire block, whispers trailing behind him as inmates watched, some uncertain, some intrigued. Eleanor Brooks was arranging books and chairs once again, noting Michael's methodical approach and the ease with which he directed a few volunteers to adjust the seating. His presence alone seemed to guide the energy in the area, and Jason Carter lingered near the fence, observing Michael's subtle interactions with others, noting the natural authority that required no raised voice or overt command. Michael crouched to help a new inmate lift a heavy stack of books, demonstrating careful technique and patience, the young man's initial hesitation melting into compliance as he followed Michael's guidance. And the other inmates, sensing the understated influence, began to adjust their own behavior, quietly showing respect and attention without overt acknowledgement. Nearby, Frank Holloway flipped through the pages of a worn martial arts magazine, confirming the subtle movements he had witnessed earlier, every gesture from Michael reflecting training and discipline far beyond the average prisoner. Michael's eyes scanned the yard continuously, catching small cues of tension and uncertainty among the group, and he addressed each with measured gestures and soft-spoken instructions, his calmness diffusing potential friction before it could arise. A group of inmates gathered near a shaded area, quietly discussing the way Michael moved and spoke, the whispers of his past as a legendary fighter permeating the courtyard, though spoken with caution. And as Eleanor began reading aloud, Michael's presence anchored the group, his posture and focus signaling authority and reassurance simultaneously. Jason shifted slightly, realizing the gray-haired prisoner's influence extended beyond mere physical presence, shaping the social dynamics in subtle yet unmistakable ways. Even those attempting to provoke or challenge appeared to reconsider, hesitation replacing prior bravado. Michael gently guided a young inmate struggling with his balance, correcting posture and encouraging precise handling of materials, the simplicity of his actions masking the depth of skill and experience behind them. Frank observed quietly, mentally noting each calculated movement, each unspoken decision, confirming the reality that Michael Harris's legendary abilities were not mere rumor, but were evidenced in the calm efficiency and respect he commanded. As the reading session progressed, the inmates adjusted their focus, the energy shifting to attentive engagement rather than idle chatter, Michael's presence transforming the yard into a space of quiet order, his actions fostering cooperation and subtle mutual respect. Eleanor glanced at Jason, who now seemed contemplative, recognizing the layers of skill, discipline, and authority that Michael projected effortlessly. The gray-haired prisoner's reputation, though quiet and unobtrusive, was now unmistakably established in the minds of all present, a combination of physical mastery, strategic awareness, and unassuming guidance that reshaped the social environment, leaving the block in a state of calm attentiveness, every movement and instruction reinforcing the idea that the quietest presence could exert the most profound influence. And as Michael concluded his involvement in the setup and settled into a chair, the yard and common area had adopted a new rhythm, a silent acknowledgement of his authority and the legend that walked among them, influencing behavior and respect without the need for any demonstration beyond the simple, deliberate, and measured actions that defined his every step. As the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the barred windows, casting long shadows across the yard, Michael Harris stood near the central walkway, observing the interactions between the prisoners with an unassuming yet unmistakable authority. Eleanor Brooks moved quietly among the tables, organizing books and supplies while glancing toward Michael for guidance, her respect for his presence evident in the subtle nods and careful attention to his suggestions. And Jason Carter leaned against the wall near the recreational area, taking mental notes of Michael's calm influence. The way his mere presence encouraged cooperation and reduced tension, Michael approached a group of new inmates who were hesitating to join the activities, offering a simple, steadying smile and a few words of reassurance, demonstrating patience and measured guidance that immediately earned quiet compliance. The prisoners gradually aligned their actions with Michael's subtle cues, adjusting their movements and tone to match his calm and confident demeanor. Even those who had previously displayed arrogance or disinterest now showed a tentative willingness to cooperate. A gentle discussion unfolded as Michael encouraged the older inmates to mentor the newcomers, guiding them in organizing supplies and maintaining order, his gestures precise yet relaxed, conveying competence without intimidation. Frank Holloway observed from a nearby bench, recognizing the refined skill in every movement, the coordination and strategic awareness that revealed Michael's legendary background. Michael shifted his attention to a minor logistical challenge, helping a group carry materials efficiently without any raised voice or commanding gestures, simply demonstrating and allowing the others to follow. Their response immediate and respectful. As Eleanor arranged the chairs for an impromptu discussion, she noted the way Michael's eyes scanned the group, sensing subtle shifts in mood and interpersonal dynamics, his awareness allowing for small corrections that kept interactions smooth and orderly. The yard now hummed with quiet energy, each prisoner engaged in their tasks with a newfound focus, Michael offering guidance where needed, reinforcing confidence and patience, his presence alone reshaping the environment into one of subtle respect and cooperation. Jason stepped forward to assist a hesitant newcomer, Michael providing encouragement and demonstrating proper handling without verbal insistence. The inmates absorbed the silent lesson, a shared understanding forming across the group. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the courtyard, Michael and Eleanor shared a brief glance, acknowledging the progress and calm authority that had settled over the block. Even the most skeptical prisoners adjusted their behavior, drawn into the rhythm established by Michael's quiet mastery. Frank observed silently, confirming the legend's presence was more than reputation. It was manifest in the subtle, efficient, and respectful interactions that now defined the entire yard. The gray-haired prisoner's expertise and demeanor leaving an indelible impression on every inmate. The space transformed through patience, observation, and unspoken guidance, culminating in a sense of order and calm that persisted as the day ended and the shadows lengthened across the concrete.